Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to Diversity in and Higher Education. My name is Nicoletta Pireddu, and I'm the inaugural director of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative. We promote interdisciplinary collaborations across departments for research, pedagogy, and public-facing projects that demonstrate the enduring value of the humanities for the understanding of the human condition. I am very grateful to Professor Tita Chico, Director of the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies at the University of Maryland, for this partnership in support of anti-racism communities and collaborations. Tonight's event contributes to this crucial ongoing discussion by focusing on diversity in academic culture and exploring ways to create a more equitable professoriate. I wish to thank our speakers and moderator, and I'm happy to hand it over to Professor Chico for some additional introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicoletta. And we're really, really grateful at the University of Maryland to be joining our colleagues across town at Georgetown to sponsor this programming. And with this programming, I want to say a few words. We commit to art as a liberatory mode and as a crucible of reckoning. The importance of community and communal histories, decentering whiteness, dismantling white supremacy, and refusing racism. And throughout, upholding and honoring the knowledge work of Black, Indigenous, and other minoritized scholars and artists. We do this, situated as we are, on a university campus built through wealth extracted by slavocrats from the labor of enslaved Black women, men, and children. And we also do this on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, to whom and for whom I offer this land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We're on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who are among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on Indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respect to the Piscataway elders and ancestors. And we ask that all of us take a moment now, and more than a moment, to consider the many, many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here today. And in saying this, I also want to invoke the words of a colleague of ours, Professor Eugenia Zarowski. For the Indigenous peoples connected to this land, the long 18th century is never over. I'm very grateful to be a colleague and friend of the moderator for today, Dr. Julius Fleming Jr. Among many things, I'll put his full biography in the chat, but among many things, he's the author of a brilliant book that will be hitting bookshelves in just a month, called Black Patience, Performance, Civil Rights, and the Unfinished Project of Emancipation, forthcoming from NYU. And with that, I will mute my microphone and ask Julius to please take over. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicolette and Tita, for those introductory remarks and introduction. Tita is a dear colleague, and I also just want to admire Tita for not only talking anti-racism, but also practicing anti-racism. Many thanks to you, our attendees, for joining us in this timely and important conversation. I now have the pleasure of introducing our two distinguished panelists, Dr. Patricia A. Matthew and Dr. Christy Pichiquero. Dr. Patricia A. Matthew is Associate Professor of English at Montclair State University, where she teaches courses on British Romanticism, the history of the novel, and British abolitionist literature. She has edited special issues of and contributed articles to journals like Romantic Pedagogy Commons, European Romantic Review, Women's Writing, and 19th-Century Gender Studies. She has written about race, portraiture, and British abolitionist material culture for The Atlantic, and race and popular culture for the Los Angeles Review of Books and the Times Literary Supplement. She is the editor of Written, Unwritten, Diversity and the Hidden Truths of Tenure, which was published by UNC Press in 2016, and has published essays and book reviews on diversity in higher education in places like PMLA, the College Language Association Journal, Signs, and the New Inquiry. Further, Dr. Matthews' work on diversity and equity has been featured in places like the Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Education, and Here to Slay with Roxane Gay and Tressie McMillan Cotton. She is the co-editor of the new Oxford University Press series, Race in 19th Century Literature and Culture, and is under contract, congratulations, to edit the Norton Library edition of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. She is writing a monograph about sugar, gender, and British abolitionist culture under contract, congratulations again, I have to keep up, with Princeton University Press. Matthew was a 2021 Center for Diversity Innovation Distinguished Visiting Scholar at the University of Buffalo and is currently a visiting associate professor in the university's English department. Welcome, Dr. Matthew. We'll also hear from Dr. Christy Pichiquero, who's Associate Professor of French and History and an affiliate of African and African American Studies, Women and Gender Studies, and the War and the Military and Society programs at George Mason University, where she also serves as the Director of Faculty Diversity in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. She has held fellowships at places like the Stanford Humanities Center and the University of Cambridge. She is the author of The Military Enlightenment: War and Culture in the French Empire from Louis XIV to Napoleon, which was a finalist for the Oscar Kensher Book Prize for Best Interdisciplinary Book in 18th Century Studies. Congratulations. Her articles on critical race theory, Afrofeminist microhistories, French exceptionalism, pedagogy, early modern language and drama, and cultures of war have appeared or are forthcoming in venues such as PMLA, Contemporary French and Francophone Studies, the 18th Century, French Historical Studies, Modern Language Notes, and Renaissance Drama. She is the president of the Western Society for French History, the recipient of the 2021 Presidential Medal for Faculty Excellence at GMU, a board member of several journals and professional societies, and a public intellectual recently featured on Mediapart, National Public Radio, NBC News, and Forbes. Please join me in welcoming our two panelists. So with those introductions, I think we'll just jump right in if that's okay. So as many of you know, not only have colleges and universities increasingly committed themselves to addressing diversity as we are now, but diversity has also become a bit of a buzzword in federal government appointments. And so we can think about the upcoming Supreme Court vacancy, but also in corporate cultures, for example. The meanings of this term, that is diversity, however, can often be capacious and even troubled, and sometimes troubling, to be honest. What does diversity mean to you? And how do we not only imagine, but also practice diversity at our respective institutions and also throughout our careers?
What do you think, Tricia? You want to take that one?
Okay, I'll start off this one and then you go start off the next one. Does that sound good?
Sounds
okay.
Good.
Julius, thank you. And Tita and Nicoletta and Karen, thank you so much for having us. I love this question because my thinking about it has shifted over time. I think for me, diversity is about equity and balancing the persistent dislodging of racist practice, while also trying to help institutions understand how to expand work they're already doing in practical ways. I try to be very mindful in my work that we don't necessarily need to reinvent every single wheel. I think the best practices of inclusion and material support, recognizing faculty labor, helping students understand why they are in classrooms, tackling complex narratives, lift everyone. In my own work, when Written and Unwritten first came out, I was invited to give a lot of talks, and I tended to give the big, broad, rhetorical representation of my research that was supposed to help everyone understand the problem. Over time, I've tried to be a little more focused and strategic. So I give those talks, but I really want to be in the rooms with leaders, institutional leaders who actually have the power to improve the conditions for faculty of color. Those are not big talks, they're not sexy talks. Sometimes it's just me and 6 or 7 people really pushing back against some of the kind of convenient narratives about, oh, we can't do this because we don't have X. And then the other thing I've wanted to do more and more, I started out listening to women of color, particularly women of color, when I visited campuses, and now strategizing with them about how to manage their diversity expectations. And I can talk a little bit about that later. And so I think in my editorial work, which is what I've done the most, I've also tried to be very mindful when I'm speaking to the people who actually publish our work about the conditions they need to create to make that work possible. So I'll just say one more thing. So briefly, I just edited a special issue for Studies in Romanticism. And my conversation with Joe Resnick was not just what the issue would be about, but how the issue would go through peer review so that we could make sure that we were actually engaging with people who gave us rigorous feedback, but that we weren't having to start from box 1. So we wanted people who maybe not were on the same page, but were at least in the same book. And I did that in large part because I wanted the contributors to understand that questions about their work were rooted in a spirit of understanding and pushing us to do our best work, not just pushing at us. So I think that those sort of things work together that I hope produce really good scholarship and then create spaces for us to do our best teaching and work for institutions.
That's so great, Tricia. And I really second everything that you said. And I'm appreciate so much the work that you're doing. And thank you again to the team here who has invited us, to Tita and to Nicoletta and Karen, who are also doing the good work, and Julius for being our moderator today. It's just a real privilege to be doing this with you and to be thinking together about this critical question. You know, I approach diversity. Sartre said that existentialism is a humanism. Well, I say that diversity is the quintessential humanism. And it's really out of that space that I approach this work, is thinking in very broad terms about human differences and about the ways that those manifest and are lived by people around us. And so that can fall into all of the traditional categories that we like to consider: gender, race and ethnicity, religious affiliation, sexuality, socioeconomic status. We don't talk about that one enough in the academy, but it is absolutely critical. Immigration status, critical, ability/disability, but also diversity of temperament, and linguistic and learning differences, political diversity. And that one is a really, I think, a key question for us to think about, certainly at my institution, where certain departments are known to be more conservative in their politics. They still represent diversity and are outstanding scholars, and are creating a space where certain types of learning can occur. And so, as a diversity practitioner, I feel that it is up to me to look at each of these individuals and to listen. And as Tricia was saying, think about how all boats can rise. How is it that we can collaborate? How is it that we can build the types of cultural competency that allow us to speak to one another, which is such a tremendous failure in our nation right now, let alone globally. And so, as I think about the categories, I too go immediately to equity, as Tricia was saying, thinking about history, thinking about power, access to privilege and power, the denial of those things, what are the processes of minoritization, and how are they happening continually right now. And as Tricia said, none of us really necessarily come into the academy aiming to be an administrator. That's not what attracts us to this work, to come into higher education. We may feel the vocation toward teaching and then also towards scholarship. But I think in many ways, if we are interested in activism and impact, we need to direct our eyes toward administration. We need to be, if not administrators ourselves, knowing our administrators, building relationships with them. Do you know your faculty handbook? Get to know that very important piece of writing in your institution. And so these are things that we learn over time, but that we can help others to learn more quickly. People don't have to learn the hard way. And I think that this is something I think about, therefore, at a sort of structural level, but also at an interpersonal level. Both of these levels are where these questions of diversity and of our practices, the way we walk in the world, are playing out.
Thank you so much. And I want to go to, Patricia mentioned the term labor, and I want to go to a question about labor in a second. But right now, I actually want to pick up on a kind of connective tissue that both of you brought up around this issue of listening, right? And I want to kind of ask you to reflect a bit about the importance of listening work to diversity, or how does listening help us to become, Christy, what you call a diversity practitioner. And we work in professions where a certain kind of mastery and expertise are required of us, where we do a lot of talking, right, in order to demonstrate this mastery and expertise. But what is the real value of sometimes sitting back and listening and even sort of inhabiting this space of ignorance when you just simply don't know? What is the importance of that kind of posture for diversity work?
Can I jump in here, Tricia? I think it's so key, Julius, just brilliant, is that posture of ignorance, of being willing to accept that, of being willing to accept that we all make mistakes, that we all have implicit biases. It's not because you come from some intersectional identity that you also don't that you don't walk through life with implicit biases. We all have them, and so it's that constant work and creating a space for authentic discussion, helping people do something that we don't do very much in life, let alone in the academy, which is to apologize. And so I think that these things are absolutely key. And I would say for myself, listening to myself. In the post-Breonna Taylor, George Floyd moment, that was a turning point for me. When I was suffering, I was unwell. That moment, I was very active in terms of peaceful protests, and everything kind of came down in that moment for me. And in listening to myself and in looking at my own raw pain, I became not only enraged, sort of swinging between rage and sorrow, and feeling that there was no hope, but then also starting to feel enlightened, to feel like I was seeing things, I was hearing myself, I was recognizing things that I hadn't before. And this is where this concept of discriminatory gaslighting that I put forward in a couple of my pieces last year, where this came from, was realizing that for so long I had blamed myself for the discrimination that was happening to me. I'm not good enough. I'm not meant to have a seat at this table. How can I get a seat at that table? How can I be taken seriously? Why am I pathologically insecure? Well, it took a drastic moment in our nation's history for me to realize that it wasn't my insecurity. It was because for so many years, I was a victim of discriminatory cultures and discriminatory structures and discriminatory behaviors by individuals. And so freeing myself, and this is sort of, one of the things that I wanted to say relating to the last piece of our conversation, the power of naming something, giving it a name. I don't want to talk about imposter syndrome anymore. I want to talk about discriminatory gaslighting. I want to talk about the things that discriminators do that cause these problems for other people of whatever the identity. And so, shifting the focus onto the misdoing rather than victim shaming and blaming. I think it's high time we do this. And, stepping forward for me as a public intellectual, it wasn't a choice anymore. I had to do it. I had to do it. And it was part of fulfilling what one of my mentors, Toni Morrison at Princeton during my undergraduate degrees, a famous quote, and it's on my website. You can look it up. She said, I tell my students, when you get these jobs that you've been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. And so it's with this in mind that I think about listening, that I think about diversity as a humanism.
That's so magnificent, Christy. All of it is just so great. I remember there was a moment that I didn't expect where I was giving a talk, and it happened that it was more department heads and sort of mid-level institutional leadership and a few faculty. And I said something that sparked a debate between those two groups of people. And I thought, hang back. It was clear that they rarely talk about this because when they're together, they have all of these other institutional pressures and the sort of just the daily grind, but they were having an actual debate. And so for me, I think the first step for me for listening was trying to figure out how to recreate that dynamic, how to have that alchemy happen again. And so when I said earlier that I started by listening to Black women, I had to do a lot of work. And everywhere I go, I have to do a lot of work to make it clear that I actually want to listen, that I'm not just sitting there being quiet, so it's my turn to talk, but I'm actually listening and allowing for the fact that there will be neat narratives I have about addressing institutional racism that don't actually work. And so it was through that listening, and specifically, I think, to women of color, that I began to understand that it was not enough for me to tell them, just say no. When you get, requests, just say no, do your work. That pushback was real. I sat in a room with the faculty of color at UNC Chapel Hill during the Silent Sam protest. They couldn't just say no, right? It wasn't just a matter of discipline and focus. They were being called from being on leave to address this urgent crisis. And so at every institution I visit, really, my goal is to figure out those moments where I can just sit back and be quiet and people can talk to one another in a way that they wouldn't normally if I weren't in the room. And so sometimes I come in as the diversity expert, and that's the position I hold. But the truth of the matter is, anywhere I go, women of color can do the talk I'm about to give, right? I've just been brought in to give the talk. We all have our histories, we all have our narratives, we all understand the problem. And so my goal is to get those women, and sometimes there are men there, but mostly it's women of color, to have a conversation where they can listen to one another so that community building can actually happen. We know the crisis. We all named it. And if we couldn't name it, we had presumed incompetent, which is like the DM, or what is it, that sort of guide that kind of diagnoses everything, right? So now we can listen to one another in terms of thinking about what we can build together.
Thank you all so much. I think you were mentioning a DSM right now, and I'm struck in your comments just how much both of you point to the role of affect in this diversity work, right? And to really think about what it means to open yourself up out of obligation versus to actually really be interested in a topic or interested in listening to someone, right? So that's something I think important to think about going forward. I want to pick up on a line that Patricia brought up around labor, and you went back to it just now. And I think it's really good that colleges and universities are investing more attention and resources in anti-racism work, right? And addressing structures of inequality. But as you know, often minority faculty and students and staff are the first ones called upon to imagine and organize and support these efforts. This is happening, of course, at the same time that, as several studies have shown, minority faculty in particular contribute disproportionate amounts of labor. So how do minority faculty, staff, and students commit themselves to doing this diversity work, this necessary diversity work, right? But also recognizing that caring for themselves is actually a radical act, and is actually quite necessary for the diversity in higher education, I think, which is also to say necessary for the future of higher education.
I'll go first because I really love this question, and I wanted to turn it away from faculty of color and towards white academics and institutional leaders who might want to figure out or ask, what can we do? Because I think that, yes, there are things we should do. We need to be strategic in how we say yes. We need to, we could talk about that. We can talk about, as I do in some of my conversations, plan our diversity interventions so that we're not running around putting out fires for institutions, because they often act like, oh my God, this is the first time this has ever happened. Let's have a steering committee and let's put an untenured person who's new to the institution, who we haven't burned out, in charge of it. And you think, oh, I'm here, I'm going to save the institution. Meanwhile, your white colleagues are doing what they need to do to get tenure. Your senior colleagues of color are exhausted. So I wanted to sort of think about this question for white academics. And I think that there's a lot of background work that needs to be done before you ask people to do any kind of diversity work at your institution. And I think you have to be very careful, for example, of who you put them in a room with. You have to think about how you can support the work that they've been hired to do materially even as you're asking them to step away from that work to attend to an institutional problem, right? And I'm thinking of most of us here as participants in the academy in various subject positions, whether we're, and I want to talk about contingent crisis later if we have time, but I'm thinking particularly of people who've made it to the tenure track or in that space between associate and full. There are just these moments when you're called upon and really expected, and we can say all day, say no, plan your time, I have a big whiteboard. These are the things I want to do. These are the things I need to do, and so on and so forth. But the real work of this has to happen among institutional leaders and how they ask us to do this work. And so who's going to be in the room? And by material support, I'm not necessarily talking about grants and funding. I'm just talking about some of us need people to transcribe our notes or to work on permissions for our book projects, like the little kind of work that we do that we give up when we do this work. And I think the other thing that needs to be attended to, though I don't have a solution, I would love to hear what Christy has to say, because I think that your relationship to the institution as kind of an actual practitioner in a way that's different than someone who comes in and gives a talk or, and then moves on. I also think we have to understand, and you've mentioned it, affect, right? What it means to be in a room and carrying the load of doing, we'll just call it diversity work. Anti-racist work is probably better. What that means confronting and who the crisis points are. Everyone who's been at an institution for 3 years, I'll just say, knows who in the room is unproductive, right? And they know the questions that are going to happen and the pushback that's going to happen. I think you have to plan for that. I think if you're going to be smart about this, so that the person of color who's carrying a disproportionate burden and for whom the risk is higher doesn't have to do all of that heavy lifting on their own. So I could say more about that, but I think that we often think about this question in terms of what we can do. But I also think that we really, and this is a way we can push back, I always say, without spending a ton of money. This is really about a thoughtfulness and a caregiving and sort of developing an environment where it doesn't always fall to people of color, to do this work. One thing I always tell people, and I learned this actually when I was listening in California, that you don't have to be the diversity on every committee, for example, but there's a middle ground between not participating and participating fully, whether you say, come to me when you've worked out X, Y, and Z. Right. And the kinds of questions you ask. I think committees that don't have money and don't have decision-making power probably aren't worth our time, for example. So I think that being just really mindful of where you're entering the institution to do this kind of work. I'll stop there.
Such a rich answer, and I so much appreciate your expertise on this, Tricia. I would only add a few things from my own experience working in this space now for a very long time. I started this work as an undergrad at Princeton, where the community service organization, African American Community Service Organization, came out of the Third World Center, which was the Black House at the time, as many of you may know. I think it's very important to make labor visible. It's something that we've talked about in other spaces. Tita has been very much creating spaces for these discussions in other fora. But then also what goes with that is a workload policy and accountability and universities don't have those enough. Does your university, does your institution have a workload policy? Do you have accounting for all of the different types of labor that faculty and staff are producing? I am on sabbatical right now with a fellowship at the University of St. Andrews. So I'm calling in from Scotland right now. And I'm learning about a different system of workload policy and accountability. And everyone groans wherever you are. But how it works here is that if you're working with a lot of PhD students, well, that diminishes expectations on service or on teaching. So there is an equation where things are meant to be visible. All systems can be gamed, and so that's a reality. But I do think that we need to stop pretending that that these different types of service and scholarly commitments also don't take time. As a faculty of color, you also attract a whole lot of graduate students who are looking for a PhD advisor who is a person of color, who brings that type of expertise, who will bring a perspective that will see them and will uplift them. And so, you know, this means that what we need to do, and it's something that we've put in place in the past years in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at George Mason in our faculty search process, which is to say, we require all members of all search committees to take a training on anti-racism and academic bias, because academic bias, it isn't just the classic sorts of implicit bias, in-group favoritism, gender biases, and other. It's also institutional bias. Why does everyone jump in the air when they hear the name Harvard? You know, you don't even have to be in the academy to have this impression about certain institutions, right? And so suddenly certain candidates are rising. Well, that means that we are adopting the structural discrimination and history of those institutions, which often are known to have major issues in this area. So, so we have to be very aware. And what we're doing now for faculty search is to say, you can't just have one equity champion on a search committee. You can't have an equity champion or a CDO, a chief diversity officer in a college, in a unit, whose responsibility is to audit the process in some way. We need to train everyone to understand all the ways that bias plays out. We have methodological biases. Some people in the social sciences have believe that quantitative methodologies are more politically viable or intellectually viable than qualitative ones, or vice versa. Subfield biases, right? How about the fact that some people may choose at this point to publish in journals that are maybe not known to be the quote unquote top tier journals, because they're actually trying to get to an audience of people who are interlocutors, right? What's it worth? And I've experienced this too many times. What's it worth to speak about our research to a room of people who are not going to actually be able to have that deep of a discussion with you, who are going to go hands off about a subject, right? So people are looking for audiences. It's very important for us to understand the ways that these things play out, and for us to know that anti-racism is everyone's work. That's all. It's everyone's work. It's not the work of the people of color. It's everyone's work. But we have to give the tools for that to happen. And for me, there's a interpersonal part of it, in that I know that I'm the face of this, and that I need to build relationships with people, build trust through that listening, through helping people to think about their positionality, for apologizing when I screw up, which I do when I make those mistakes, is to come forward and to explain myself. So you know, the reality of invisible labor and of cultural taxation, which is something, Julius, that you mentioned in some of our exchanges prior to this session. Those things are very real, but it's only in spreading education that people will be able to feel empowered in the end, regardless of their background, to weigh in on these issues and to play a valuable role. And I do believe it in the end. I do believe that every person has a unique contribution to make, and it is up to us to help them see that sometimes, and to empower folks to step forward and to play a role in making higher education better.
No, that's great. And I'm going to follow up on something you both said in a second, but I just want to shout out my colleague, Tita, for doing the very things that you all have talked about, especially around this question of labor, because not only has Tita brought material resources, right, that recognize what it means to labor as someone who's often called upon to labor. She's also done things like read entire manuscripts among my colleagues in African American and African diaspora studies, right? And sometimes I actually think she's a part of our area group, and she's really not. So I just wanted to shout out Tita for actually doing the things that you all are talking about. So Patricia, you actually mentioned, and you actually practiced, you performed kind of speaking to our white colleagues, right, about what they can do in this anti-racist work. And Christy, you talk about the importance of anti-racist education. And as we know, both of these things have come under attack, right? During our last presidential administration and federal agencies, there were these bans on anti-racist trainings, for example, but also we have state governments now saying, you know, we can't teach things in schools that make white people feel bad. And so we've seen a kind of banning of texts. We've seen a banning of critical race theory, especially at the K-12 school district level across the country. Many minority faculty, though, actually work on the text and ideas that are being banned by these individuals. And in higher education, we're often cautioned to make our work legible to the higher ups. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I suspect that higher education is not immune from the sort of dark impulses that are driving this policing of knowledge at the K-12 level. Can you talk a bit about the dynamics of working on minoritarian people, things, and ideas under these conditions, and sort of what institutions of higher learning can do to actually support this work among minority faculty in particular?
I can go. I see Christy smiling at me. I'll go. I think this question is interesting because for two things. I think this is where I imagine the particular vulnerability of our contingent colleagues. And I think that works on a number of levels. It's not just that they're untenured, which they are. It's not just that they don't have the stability that comes with a tenure track position, their contract labor, they're working sometimes from semester to semester. I think they're also vulnerable because they're also often at the first they're in the first line, because so often they're not teaching majors in the humanities, they're teaching first-year students who are wrestling with really complex ideas for the first time in their lives in an institution that has taught them that they're consumers, not students, right? So I was thinking about this question, and for me, it feels kind of theoretical. I'm tenured, I'm an associate professor. I do, you know, in terms of like institutional anxiety about what might get in my way or where I might be held to account. Where it is, I think, a challenge is if you happen, like Christy and I both do, to work in pre-1900 European fields. This is happening, I think, across. We can think about what's happening in early modern studies. We can think about what's happening in medieval studies, in sort of Romanticism and in 18th century studies. When you raise those questions among your peers, who also imagine themselves expert. And that's a different track, I think, than maybe you were considering, but I think it's where that work happens, where there's friction and the pushback is aggressive and the stakes are really high, right? People's careers are at stake. These are the people who are going to review your manuscripts for publication. They're going to serve on editorial boards for journals. They will have a say about even how you express your research. In other words, do you take an approach to your critical framework that includes personal anecdote to get to your argument? So I think that there are kind of different sites in the academy where this is a crisis. And I think that I think it can be more challenging because often, and Christy, I'll be curious to correct me or add to this or pull this out in a different way. I also think we're often being challenged by people who also imagine themselves as experts in our field, right? The K through 12 narrative is we have parents or legislatures or private corporations drumming up outrage and pretending that the outrage is happening at a different level. But within our disciplines, we are confronting colleagues who have more institutional power or more institutional reach, who also imagine that they're not racist, right? They imagine that the things that they're talking about and the questions they're asking are just part of a robust debate. And it's all theoretical, and they are inclined. I was rereading Ahmed's on being included, and the debates that happen on the pages of journals where people are theoretical about violence and think, oh, you know, you're sort of wrapped in identity politics, or your skin is thin. I think that those are the sites that are incredibly intense. And my experience, I feel I'm part of a community, a multiracial, interdisciplinary community of scholars, where I walk into these spaces, into these sort of literary critiques, right, into the literary community, knowing that my ideas are vetted and that we can suss through. You can't gaslight me, because there are too many people around me who will say, oh, no, that critique, that's not real, right? That's about something X or something Y. And so I think that my experience in that way is very different. But I do hope, and I think maybe in your question, there was a bit of about advocacy. I do hope that institutional leaders will spend more time than they have already understanding the political moment that we're in and having informed responses that are not just make it go away, right? Bad publicity is terrifying. These things are coordinated, we have to understand. I'm thinking of the history professor at a school in Texas who was terminated. They just had to pay her not enough money, but she got a fiscal reward, a fiscal settlement for for disrupting her academic freedom. So I would call on administrators to have a plan in place. Right? There are things we can't control. There are firestorms that spring up that we can't anticipate, but we know that we're in this moment. We know that campus reform is real. We know that they scour the internet and they're looking for ways to catch us in thinking and misrepresenting it. They're now training students about how to ask a question that will lead to an answer that they can then catch on video recording and put out in the world. So I think we have to be very, and when I say be savvy, I'm not saying hold back, right? I think we have to be savvy in supporting faculty of color and understanding that this is expertise, that this is not simply our experiences that we write onto history, that there's a methodology that informs critical race theory, that there's a methodology that forms anti-racist pedagogy. It's not just about feelings, and it's not just about, I want to figure out the best way to say this. Social justice is one end, but this is also about developing a community of critical thinkers who know how to ask smart questions about everything in front of them, from information they see on the news to text they read to what they watch on television.
So powerful. Thank you for that, Tricia. I want to build also on the reminiscent of the name of this series, which is about community and collaboration, because I think that these are really key avenues for progress and for sustainability. I think as we think about contingent faculty, whether that be the scores of adjuncts that work in our universities, professors of practice who are on short-term contracts, whose contracts are very easy to terminate, this is the mass of professors in higher education, and so something that I've started to do, and that I think is really is something for us to experiment with, is in acknowledging the power and privilege that some of us do have. I have tenure now, and tenure, I know, Tricia, this is something that you said, that, if we depend on tenure in order to step forward, it may be too late. Waiting till tenure is too late. I'm one of those people that waited till tenure. I did not feel, or very close to tenure, I did not feel safe in my discipline or in my institution in some ways to be able to move forward and to be the kind of person that I wanted to be as a scholar and as a human being. So the power of intersectional racism and of misogynoir in particular cannot be underestimated. For my dissertation, my research specialty, I purposefully did not work on people of color. I said, I don't want to have to be someone whose intelligence will constantly be undercut because people think I'm doing me-story instead of history. I need, and of course, hilariously, I ended up studying the 18th century French military. But if you read my book, a little plug, you won't get what you think. This is not a classic military history. There's a lot to do with the role of minoritized people, whether it be women, Native Americans, South Asians, or the enslaved and freed African descended people of the French Empire at the time. So there's a whole other story in there, which is part of enlightenment, in my view, in that context. But for example, on my book, I did not put a picture of myself. I did not want people's impressions of my book to be skewed by looking at my face and bringing their implicit biases about my identity. Now I look back and it is tragic. It is sad that this book that came out in 2017 with Cornell, that was my decision-making behind it. I said, I need the book to stand alone. And so if I had had a stronger community at that time, if I had felt empowered at that time, and even earlier than that, far earlier than that, to find legitimacy in certain interests and in what I brought to those interests specifically. Happily, I was able to still make a different kind of argument in the space of military and cultural history of the French Enlightenment. I'm glad that happened. But at the same time, I think we need to be creative about how we build community and how we think about collaborations. Co-authorship and sharing research so that we can tell more global stories. Anti-Blackness as a global phenomenon. It is a global phenomenon. The fact that we are trained along national lines is completely arbitrary, and it allows us to ignore the realities of these histories and of these lived experiences. So I think it's very key for us as scholars and as intellectuals to move beyond the strictures of our training according to disciplines and according to nations. So I think that's really key. Something that I do at Mason now, I have a colleague in criminology, law, and society who said, I really want to talk about the Renee Rogers case, Renee Rogers versus American Airlines. If you don't know about it, it's worth checking it out. Renee Rogers, who after a career of 11 years with American Airlines, was put on a customer-facing job and was wearing cornrows and was told that she would need to either straighten her hair or pull it back because those cornrows were unacceptable for customer-facing work. She sued them for discrimination and lost with claims against badge of slavery, so the that amendment, and then also Title VII. So this professor, who was a white man, said, would you come in and talk to my students? Can you help me with this conversation? Because I bring it to it my positionality, and I will acknowledge that, and I have lots to say about this case, but how can our collaboration enrich what happens in that space? And so I think it's important for us to do that with colleagues who are in contingent positions. It's easier to call in folks who are tenured to come in and say, let me talk to you about the birth of critical race theory. Let me talk to you about critical legal studies, which is where all of this comes from, and talk about its evolution into these concepts, its evolution into something that was sort of depoliticized. Intersectionality became depoliticized for quite a while, right? And it's only now returning to its original political significance of advocacy on behalf of Black women. So I think that in acknowledging our own opportunities to bring something in the form of collaboration is really key here. And so it's one of the reasons that I truly appreciate the framework that this team has brought forward in terms of communities and collaboration. I think that these approaches go way further than we imagine.
I'm just struck by, thank you all so much for those answers. I'm struck by the kind of catalog of labor that actually goes into doing your job, right? So I heard you, Patricia, talk about, how do you navigate gaslighting attacks at conferences, for example? How do you lecture knowing that you might be recorded and a piece of your lecture might become viral and you might be attacked by certain segments of the population? The energy that it takes to decide whether or not to put your picture on the cover of something that you probably worked on nearly a decade, or, I often think about, should I wear my earrings to faculty meeting or not? Should I keep my dreadlocks or not? These things are also forms of labor and they consume people. And I imagine that this also contributes to why so many minority faculty die early. So just thank you all for kind of fleshing out, in real time what that labor looks like beyond the committee work, for example. I had a question, and I don't think we'll get to it, but I really sort of want to start talking about, recently in the wake of many high-profile murders of Black people by police and others, there's been a kind of specific attention given to anti-Black racism. But I was at a meeting actually on campus that was addressing anti-Black racism, and someone who's not Black said, well, what about other minority communities, especially people with disabilities, the largest minority group in the country? Which is to say, well, why are we focusing so much on Black people and they're not even the largest? Well, there are Black and disabled people, we can have the conversation, but it was I was so shocked I didn't have a response, right? And so a part of what I want to continue to think about is sort of how do we not get into those oppression Olympics, right? And Krista, as you said, sort of engage in acts of diversity that are collaborative and communal rather than competitive. We only have about 4 minutes left, and I want to take those last minutes because I invited undergraduate students here, and I think there are other undergraduates here, to just speak directly to them, because when I look at them, when I'm lecturing, I see the professors, I see the provosts, I see the deans, right? And in many ways, they are the future of higher education, and they hold the kind of greatest possibility for what diversity might become. So in the few minutes we have, what would you all say to them about how they might be involved now and sort of going forward to think about a more diverse institution of higher learning?
Tricia wants me to take this one. So Julius, you want us to address undergraduates who are coming up right now. You are not alone. Isolation is one of the most dangerous things of this path, of the path toward of higher education. You can come find us, build community, trust yourself. If you have a sense that something is confusing, that something is wrong, it's not because you're stupid, it's because you're probably right. And other people have that question as well. I second-guessed myself for far too long, waited to ask the question, thinking that it wasn't a smart one, thinking that I was confused because I'm a public school kid. No, we're just as smart as everyone else. We have something specific to contribute. These years are your years. These years are yours to build the pathway toward your dreams. And those dreams may change. I had a first career as an opera singer. I just met with a colleague here in Scotland, and I told him how old I was. He said, "Oh, I thought you were younger than that." I said, I'm old. I've been around. I had a first career. And that's okay. You need people who will not try to take your light away from you, who are going to support your accomplishments. I recommend that you make a mentorship map. And if you don't know what that is, shoot me an email. We can work with you so that you can really map out your community. And it's not necessarily, as we know, your family who's going to show up first and say, what you're doing is a good idea. They're dealing with financial pressures. We all are. They have their ideas and their backgrounds. Who are those people who see your light and who want to support you in your vision of being the person who you want to be in this world? We're out there. People are out there. And so let folks help you to move through this intentionally and with confidence.
I think that's glorious. I think that's glorious. I think when you imagine community as a young person who I think you're all coming of political age in a very particular time when we're very clear about what's the best and what's the worst. And I would advise that you have a community, and it goes back to what Christy said at the beginning, where people don't have to be perfect, right? I want to write an essay one day called On Critique. And I want to think about the best ethical way to engage with one another when we see someone we respect and care about, or it has asked a question in a way or done work in a way that doesn't line up with what our ideal. And I think that community building has to be about not just looking outward towards the challenges that young people face and that we all face, but actually how do we work together, right? I think we have to let go of the idea that there's only one. I think we have to let go of the idea that everybody has to speak and think in the same register. I think we have to trust people and let them come in where they are. I think sometimes when we've encouraged young people to behave as if they were all born fully formed out of the head of Cornel West or Audre Lorde, like we come into these conversations in different ways with different experiences. And sometimes I think we apply, as we're building community, a kind of purity tests when people are still trying to work things out. And I worry when I look at the way, and I think of the way that young people are forming political alliances and imagining themselves as political beings much earlier than I did, right? I think I'm 50 something. And I think I got to live in a little bubble where I got to sort of very slowly and carefully enter into the world as a political being. You don't have that luxury now, right? And the stakes seem so high. And I think there can be so much pressure to perform a kind of politics and to dismiss people who don't perform that politics in the same way. So I think that as you're seeking, and I think you're follow every bit of advice that Christy gave you, but also be gentle with one another and sort of be a soft landing space as people are trying, but you're all trying to work things out. And we have to be generous with one another. We just have to practice generosity. Doesn't mean there's no critique, doesn't mean there's no disagreement, but we have to just, I think, especially as people of color, the world is hard enough on us as it is. Let's sort of hold one another to an intellectual standard, but be tender about it.
Patricia, Christy, thank you all so much. This was wonderful. And I certainly look forward to continuing the conversation over the months and years to come. Thank you.